in a lot of ways, I had kind of stepped back from doing museum work in my own scholarship, and yet I never stopped thinking about museums. And so this was kind of maybe a last-minute invitation out of the blue, but it was welcome, and I've been thrilled to come. It's been a pleasure to meet so many people whose work I've been reading and benefiting from. Mary Bouquet's Academic Anthropology in the Museum I'm referencing in an article that's coming out, and reading Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett since when I was in graduate school. So being able to put faces with the names and meet so many people that care about the same kinds of issues that I do, it's just been a wonderful couple of days. I also want to express thanks for our tech help in back, because as you're about to see, we have a video and it's been embedded, so thanks very much to Ashwin for the tech help. So I am going to talk about nothing. That's the fun part. I wasn't kidding, Barbara, last night. You're welcome to steal it. A museum of nothing? Exhibitions about museums and nothing? Yeah, we need to do this. I've already got some ideas. And then, of course, the one in Warsaw is already there. So just briefly, the way I got here. First, I thought about being a German historian, and that's the book Wayne mentioned. And then I thought about trying to be a real German historian. And then I started getting interested in photographs, because I've been teaching a course on the Holocaust for about 22 years now. And I started thinking about the significance of the atrocity photography as historical evidence of the Holocaust. And that led me into a whole nother investigation about photographs as historical evidence. And out of that comes nothing. So what I've decided is I'm a historian of historical consciousness. That's what I do. That's what I care about. Everything I write about, it's got something to do with that. And with that, believe it or not, so do these guys. So we're going to start with the band Bastille playing their song, which I guess is still a hit here, Pompeii.
I was left to my own devices. Many days fell away with nothing to show, and the walls kept tumbling down in the city that we love. Great clouds roll over the hills, bringing darkness from above. But if you close your eyes, it'll almost feel like nothing changed at all. And if you close your eyes, it'll almost feel like you've been here before. How am I gonna be an optimist about this? How am I gonna be an optimist about this? We were caught up and lost in all of our vices. In your poses, the dust settled around us, and the walls kept tumbling down in the city that we love. Great clouds all over the hills, bringing darkness from above. But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing changed at all? And if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like you've been here before? How am I gonna be an optimist about?
I quite like this song. I'd love to listen to the whole thing, but let's just pause for a minute because we don't have a lot of time, and let's look at where they are. So they're in the British Museum. They are surrounded by these frescoes, and sorry if I've used the wrong word for them, the murals on the walls. And they're singing about nothing's changed at all, and the walls keep tumbling down, and they're talking about an experience that sounds like it has a duration into the present. So apart from, the vanity side of this is a band that has a pop song. This is a marketing tool for the British Museum. They have invited the band to come to the museum with their popular song to record a video so that it's marketing positively for the museum as well as for the band. Okay, all that to the side. What they're talking about is nothing has changed at all. So what I want to talk about is how do we judge distances between the past and the present, and why does it sometimes feel like nothing has changed at all, and at the same time, sometimes it feels like nothing happened, and sometimes it feels like nothing is the way it was. Are we talking about the same nothing for each of those experiences of historical consciousness? How far away is then from now? So in addition to the lyrics of the song, and I'll just put them up here again in case you didn't catch them, if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing changed at all? And does it almost feel like you've been here before? How am I going to be an optimist about this? This is about hope. Do I want to think about the positive things that can happen in the future when I know how bad things have been in the past? Do I want to remember the past because it was bad, because I need to honor the memory? Or do I want to be an optimist and think, okay, that one bad thing happened back then, but thank God we're still here. I want to use that to connect to, oh, sorry, thought I had the text here. A poem. And the reason this poem keeps showing up in my work, it was in the first article I ever published, was because I read it in high school, in a high school poetry book in my English class, and I thought, this guy gets it. And so it's always stuck in my mind. And the guy who got it was an English poet named Henry Reed. And the poem is called Judging Distances, and he's speaking autobiographically about his own experiences in the British military when he's being asked to, he's doing his boot camp training, and he's being asked to learn how to conduct surveillance. So he's being asked to learn how to report accurately about how you judge the distance between two objects. And this is how he introduces it. I'll only read you the first two parts of the poem, the first two stanzas. Not only how far away, but the way that you say it is very important. Perhaps you may never get the knack of judging a distance, but at least you know how to report on a landscape. The central sector, the right of arc, and that to which we had last Thursday. And at least you know that maps are of time, not place, as far as the army happened to be concerned. The reason being is one which need not delay us. Again, there are only three kinds of tree, three only: the fir, the poplar, and those that have bushy tops too. And lastly, that things only seem to be things. Okay, that's just the first two stanzas. Basically, what he's going to decide is that the distance between him and the landscape that he's reporting on is at least 1.5 years, because that's how long he anticipates that he is going to be in the military before he gets out again. So when you're judging distances, he says it's about time and about place, and it's about your relationship between the past and the present, and that's what you're always thinking about. In both the song's lyrics and in Reed's poetry, there's suggestions of affinity, of empathy, of figures preserved across time, even if they are embalmed, of collapsing time so that the past feels present to you, because the remnants of a disaster or the remnants of the objects in the landscape are present to you as visible. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how when you are measuring between time and space, the instruments measuring either one are supposedly objectively recording the data. Reed is sensitive to how objective recordings leave out some vital data about how the recorder is feeling in the present, about the task at hand, and how it is being received by someone who needs the accurate data, and that's actually quite important in surveillance, but is also subjectively feeling. In other words, they need the data, they need it, it's important, it's vital. That feeling is also left out of the analysis. So needing happens in the present, and yet we tend to leave out that emotional valence when we think about judging the distance. For museums, this represents a complicated task of how to be in the present while representing or representing the past, bringing the past into the present. Like Wayne, I Googled some stuff on temporality in the museum, and I found a really interesting article by Jean-Paul Martinon. It's from 2006. It's called Museums and Restlessness. And he provocatively suggested that museums have no future. They have only presence in which they are constantly remaking themselves. So we can't define, he writes, we can't define what a museum is because it is always becoming itself. It is always at the center of its own redefinition, and that, for a museum, is the present. I was also recently reading a terrific article by Deborah Silverman in the Journal of Modern History, and she's talking about a museum that I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with. Right, so this Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium is closed and being renovated, and the idea is it's being updated in ways that I understand the Rijksmuseum has already been through. So the question that Silverman raises is, how can a museum deal with the past And will the replacement of the past with the present be an adequate strategy for moving forward? And so what she's concerned with is that, in a way, when you renovate and take out the evil, it's been referred to in these past 2 days, or the negative ways in which ethnographic practices have been represented in the museum, that feels time for an overhaul. When you take that out, do you erase it? And in erasing it, are you doing a disservice to museum visitors as well as to history and memory? So as I'm reading Silverman and thinking about it, I thought, has nothing changed at all? Does the future have to be static as well as the present and the past? Does it all have to look the same at the same time? And what I thought as I was looking at the museum and thinking about her article was, well, why don't they just make a museum out of the museum? In other words, don't renovate the interiors to change the objects and how they're being represented. Leave the museum and leave it open, and maybe insert some new tags on the outside of it rather than the inside before everybody walks through it, so you know what you're getting. You're getting a historical object. It was a museum of the way that Africa was represented, and particularly the history of the Congo in colonialism. Why not let people see that? So can you make a museum out of the museum? That's one question. Wayne also put me onto a terrific set of photographs by Anouk Steketee, who was commissioned by this museum here to go to Jakarta and the area around there, and she was photographing historical reenactment. So in particular, this project, which is called The Past is a Foreign Country, two things I want to say about that. Primarily, the subjects of the photographs are dressing themselves up as Dutch colonials. And in particular, in the captions are terrific. They are very informative. A couple of the guys said, well, okay, we had a Dutch colonial past. It doesn't all have to be bad. They had great bikes. We really like those bikes. So we dress up this way and we cycle. And they really enjoy doing this. This is a weekend club that gets together. So if the past is a foreign country, usually what we say next is they do things differently there. What this photography suggests to me is the past is a foreign country and we do things differently there. Both the we that's in the cycling club and the we that is looking at these photographs. It's when we choose to remember that the past becomes a different thing. Similarly, I was really struck by an exhibit at the Arizona State Museum. I'm going to talk a lot about this if I have time. By some contemporary artists that are looking at traditional forms of their own art and remaking it in the present. And the one you're looking at here is by Susan Falwell. It's called Walking in Two Worlds. She's from Santa Clara Pueblo. So this is from 2014. And I want to use this to suggest that when we say that nothing is the way that it was, there's a lot of different ways to understand that. On the one hand, it's a cliche because it expresses the ordinary sensation of change over time in a very commonsensical way. There's the way things were, there's the way things are now, and that's not the same. I can imagine someone shaking their head as they say this. So ineluctable is change, so strange, so unavoidable, so unexpected. Somebody just said it earlier this morning. The only thing, was it Jenny? The only thing that we can say about change is that it's going to happen, it's constant, it's always happening. It's not exactly what was said. So let me say this. If nothing is the way it was, then we can perceive difference between past and present and anticipate a future in which the present won't look like the way it was either. Without a perception of the need to account for change over time, we wouldn't need history. We humans would simply persist, and there would be no need to interpret or explain the past. But instead, we have nothing to explain because nothing is the way it was. So we need history to help us understand the past that has happened. But if nothing is the way that it was, then very bizarrely there's an oxymoron buried in the baseline of modern historical consciousness. Nothing both is and was, which would make nothing seem, in fact, the same thing rather than no thing. Nothing is the way it was offers an incredibly malleable metaphor for history, but not for the apparently obvious reason having to do with time and change. Nothing is worth pondering from the perspective of historical consciousness precisely because of its static nature. Everything changes, except nothing. Nothing remains the same. That is, nothing remains nothing. And it turns out that history is both a response to change over time and a continuum of nothing remaining the same. Nothing is and nothing was. And I think Susan Falwell does this really brilliantly here. On the right-hand side of the pot, you have women with traditional Hopi hairstyles, and they're working on basketry in the traditional way. And then you look on the left-hand side, and what have they got? Starbucks cups. And they have their iTunes, basically there's even a little Apple logo. I don't know if you guys can see it on each of those white phones hanging from their necks. So I thought this was brilliant. I'd like to consider how nothing happens. So the word nothing might have many kinds of meanings. It might be the failure of something to occur, nothing happened. It might be boredom, yeah, there was nothing going on, nothing happened. It can be long stretches of time in which, as Hayden White pointed out in the content of the form, this is dating me, this is back from the 80s, right? In regards to data recorded in medieval chronicles, when noteworthy events were scarce. And so this is why, as we all know, during the Middle Ages, nothing happened, right? That's why they were called the Dark Ages. Apparently, there was a lot of nothing if you judge by the many years gaps in these records. So for instance, the Saracens came for the first time in 725, but doesn't that mean that somebody recorded it after the fact? How did they know it was the first time? Right. So this is pretty much how the chronicles always get done, but look how many blank years are in there. And look at sometimes the years are all in one year line, like 1715, 1716, 1717. Not, a lot of nothing happening between 715 and 717. When there's nothing to do, time moves more slowly, and tedium ensues, and it all feels like too much nothing. When something should have happened, but nothing happened, the absence of justice can be perceived as a failure of vast proportions. I'm referring here to Alessandro Portelli's now classic oral history study, The Death of Luigi Trastulli. He interviewed Turin factory workers in the 1970s, and they recalled the shooting of one of their fellow workers who joined them in a strike in the 1950s. Nothing happened to the guys who shot him, is what they remembered in the 1970s, and to them, that meant justice had not been served. But in reality, the presumed perpetrators had experienced quite a lot of life in the years that followed, just not jail time. And the survivors experienced a delayed and deferred present in which what was supposed to happen didn't. Over and over, and always nothing happened. So we speak of nothing in order to express the extent of the absence, as vast as empty space, as timeless as boredom. The quality of nothing is so vast that once it appears under the historian's nose, it's rather difficult not to notice and not to wonder why it seemed invisible before. Nothing encompasses lack of value as well as lack of absence. It's everything that everyone paid attention to, but because it wasn't worth paying attention to. Sorry, let me say that again. It's everything that everyone paid no attention to because it wasn't worth paying attention to. Nothing lacked value because, well, it was worth nothing. And anyway, hard to see because there was nothing there. So all along, there was nothing to see. And it's just that no one was looking. Or if anyone looked, they saw nothing and they shrugged. Nothing special, nothing worthy of attention. In the end, if you're done, there's nothing left to say. But we keep writing histories, which means that histories are written because there is nothing left to say. So histories of nothing are always ready to be written, and I will add now exhibitions of nothing are always waiting to be staged. All right, so thinking about time in the museum, I'd like to propose that there's a whole lot of nothing out there. This is another kind of nothing I want to consider. I'm really proud of my student, Gabe Dale. He's a history major and astronomy minor, and he was doing an internship at the University of Arizona Museum of Art. And this is what he decided to do for his internship. He was measuring light years. So he says, while the name might lead you to believe that a light year is a measure of time, it's actually a measure of distance. It is the distance that light travels in 1 year. The purpose of this exhibit is to consider our place in the universe using art history as a reference point. Throughout these galleries, so these are a permanent exhibition at the University of Arizona Museum of Art. He says, I've displayed astronomical objects that are roughly as many light years away as select works from the Museum of Art permanent collection are old. So for example, if you were to go out tonight and look at the Helix Nebula, the light you would see would have left this star at roughly the same time that Pacino di Bonaguida painted the tabernacle with scenes from the life of Christ, or the Aztecs founded Tenochtitlan in today's Mexico City. Or to bring things closer to home, what is the distance of the sun from the earth as measured in light minutes? The light leaving the sun is at this very moment won't reach the earth for about 8 minutes, which is roughly the playing time of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. All right, so here's how he did it. So you can see on the far right one of his astronomical photographs, and then he explains the measurement of the light years, and he also talks about something specific to that space object. And if you look in the background, you'll see that there are 3 additional of those kinds of photographs next to Renaissance paintings, and some later ones. So I'll give you a slightly more close-up example. And it's in the note to the slide rather than in my text. Doggone it. Let's see if I've got it close up. Can we zoom here? It's not going to let us. All right. I know this is Andrea del Sarto. Sorry. And picture of the Holy Family, 1525. All right, that was going to be my close-up example. Anyway, I thought this was brilliant, that he considered taking the concept of light years into the museum. So he's showing us that you can have multiple temporalities on display in the same place at the same time. And he's showing that time has depth, that the sky has depth, that's been measured in light years, and that bright objects are not equidistant in time, even though the eye perceives them all simultaneously. So the past is actually vivid as light in the present. It is literally shedding light on the present. I'm not going to show you the video clip now in the interest of time, but I can highly recommend this film. If you've ever got a chance, you need to watch this. Nostalgia for the Light. Patricio Guzman is a filmmaker from Chile, and he's done a lot of filmmaking in regards to recent political and historical events in his country. And he continues his consideration of history and memory in the film Nostalgia for the Light from 2011. I had a particular affinity for this because a lot of the mirrors for these observations, sorry, I'm spacing. The mirrors that go into these observatories are actually spun in the basement of the Arizona Stadium on the campus of the University of Arizona. And I've had a chance to go into the mirror lab and watch them being made. And it is astonishing to see a mirror roughly the size of this room being spun. So the research that's going on there has a U of A connection. Sorry, U of A's University of Arizona. But what Guzman does in the film is that he considers the parallel types of inquiry that we make into stellar objects, into the nothing that is space. We look for the origins of the universe. We look for the Big Bang. And at the same time, as you see in the bottom right of this image, there are women who continue day after day, decade after decade, to look through the vast nothing of the Atacama Desert for the remains of their loved ones who were disappeared under the Pinochet regime. So Guzman talks to the astronomers, he talks to the women, and then he has the astronomers talk to the women, and he finally brings the women into the observatory. So all through the movie, he is drawing connections between 2 different kinds of investigations into the faraway past and the faraway present, the invisible present of the disappeared who are here among us, and the almost invisible presence of the birth of our universe at the same time. What would you do? Show the film in the museum? It's a way of thinking about exhibiting multiple temporalities in one place, in this case in the film. All right, now I'd like to talk about nothing in photographs. As I've discovered, the longer I've worked on photographs as historical evidence, everybody's going to refer to Susan Sontag and they're going to refer to Roland Barthes. So I'm just going to get the Barthes reference out of the way here. But there's a really good reason for it, and it's not just obligatory. It's customary for those who are working on Barthes to cite camera lucida. But I'd like to point out that it's really full of nothing. I haven't done a word count, but the word nothing appears on at least 10 different pages in the middle of the book in significantly different ways. And after Barthes gets to the image at the center of the book, the absent photograph of his mother, nothing is all over the page, and this is what he writes. The horror is this: nothing to say about the death of one whom I love most, nothing to say about her photograph, which I contemplate without ever being able to get to the heart of it, to transform it. I have no other resource than this irony to speak of the nothing to say. On the same page, he notes that history and photography are coeval products of the Western 19th century, and I would add, so is the modern museum. They grew up together and they produced nothing. That is, they engendered a fascination with the ironic condition of distance from the subject of our most passionate interest, the past and the dead. So when we think about the past and we write histories about it, we're speaking all about and around the nothing that ineffably eludes our grasp, just like an absent photograph. But even when we have the photograph, there is still nothing to say. A lot of times people will say photographs speak for themselves, images speak for themselves. We don't need to add anything, it's that resonant. I disagree 100%. We must speak. There is only speaking for photographs. We know nothing about a photograph until we articulate it, in fact, ventriloquize for it, in fact, embody it through our voices. They are, in fact, to borrow from Kenner earlier today, objects without agency until we embody them through our voices. So having suggested that, I also have been really influenced by the work of Elizabeth Edwards in looking at photographs in ethnographic collections. And so I just want to highlight a couple of aspects of her work that has been influential on mine. Writing with Matt Mead in an essay called Absent Histories and Absent Images, Photographs, Museums, and the Colonial Past, they noted that while almost all museums employ photographs in their public galleries in some way, the problematic of photographs in the museum space exists precisely in their unproblematized use. That is, most of the time, unfortunately, and she's suggesting museum professionals are as blasé about the use of photographs as the public is. They expect them to speak for themselves, to create context and atmosphere, to borrow words from Mary's presentation earlier. And the photographs are just there. That's also a direct quote from one of the anonymous curators that Edwards and Sigrid Lean talked to. So when photographs are used, they are reduced to elements of color, form, and style in order to create some kind of affect and atmosphere. They are also, in the process, often manipulated beyond recognition, and certainly beyond any claim to be a historical document. Changes in the size of photographs, for instance, are used to orchestrate a narrative drama of display, from the intimate to the awe-inspiring. So in other words, in museum display, it has become quite common not only to reproduce photographs oversized on the wall as illustration, background, wallpaper, but in doing so to transform the original material, often three-dimensional, we're not talking about born digital, we're talking about historical photographs, the original material object into an inanimate object when it's projected, or to replace it in an oversized physical object. So you've lost the sense of scale, which is also going to affect the way that people respond to it. But this is done as regular order of business in the museum. So this is unproblematic and unproblematized. So one of the things I want to do is precisely problematize it. And I'm going to give you one case study. So I was interested in Edward Curtis's photography and specifically how it has come to be used as background in ethnographic and art and history and just about any kind of museum you can think of. So what you see here are two of Edward Curtis's photographs. So these would have been taken sometime between 1890 and the mid-1930s. It was an enormous project, and I'm hoping people are already familiar with it because I'm not going to give a lot of information about it here, just about how it's been reproduced and used. I think the example, what you see here in two separate rooms in the Arizona State Museum is pretty typical and unproblematic for most of us, right? There are real pots, they're really there, that's a real photograph. Okay, it's a reproduced photograph. It's not the original Curtis photogravure, but these are reproduced images showing people actually making pots, so it seems relevant for context, for illustration. I'd like to compare this, not contrast it. I would like to compare it to the Chihuly Glass and Garden Gallery, which is the #1 tourist attraction in Seattle at the moment. It's recently opened in 2012. It is dedicated solely to the art glass of Dale Chihuly. And in the northwest room, which is one of the first ones you walk into, what you are confronted with is a wall of quilts that are produced by quilt makers of the Pacific Northwest of various tribal affiliations. And on the adjacent wall, the Curtis photographs, also organized kind of in a quilt-like grid on the side. It's almost like you have a quilt made of images on the right-hand wall. And these are both there to suggest, to evoke a context of Indianness. I hate to say it that way, see my scare quotes, but I really think that's the effect in this room. Because none of the people in the images are identified as individuals. None of the quilt makers are identified as individuals. There is no agency in this room. There's just the objects that have been reproduced. This was the poster for the exhibit at the Arizona State Museum. It was actually a series of 3 exhibits. And what they did is they had photogravures of from Curtis, specifically of tribes that are based in the American Southwest, because that was more relevant to the location in Tucson. So they had already selected those kinds of images. They hung those in one gallery, and then you walked across the entryway space, and you entered a separate gallery where Susan Falwell's pot and others by contemporary Native American artists were represented. So basically the museum asked several artists to respond to the Curtis photographs on the wall, and that art then was displayed adjacent. But this was the poster that was advertising the next to the last exhibition. And I find it kind of troubling, in part because it shows one of Curtis's photographs, again, untagged. You don't know who this woman is. You don't know if it's a woman. You don't know the identity of the individual. You don't know that anything about it. Nothing about it, and yet it has been chosen as representative, right? This is for all Curtis photographs, and by the way, Curtis is the only name that appears, right, on the whole thing. So his identity is what matters, not this person's identity. I'd like to come back to one of the unproblematized photos, and this is called, in the tag that the museum created, it's called Mojave Water Carrier by Edward S. Curtis, 1903. It's a remarkably stationary woman holding a child while balancing a pot on her head, and indeed her balancing act is as much the subject of this image as the basket. And what I'd like to suggest here is that her identity has not only been lost, so has the child's, and this kind of came up in, I think it was Benoit's presentation yesterday. I was asking you about the skull in the photograph that was in the background, and the skull in the photograph, it turned out, were unrelated. But in the photograph, there were at least 2 people, and in the foreground, there was only 1 skull. So in these ways, we dehumanize when we remove identity. So the identity of the child is just not even part of anything in this representation, unless it's supposed to make this woman maternal or somehow have to do with reproduction within the tribe. Basically, I think this is about the pot. But I asked the curators also, what is the Mojave Water Carrier? Is it the object or is it the person? And I thought it was really ambivalent, and they were surprised that I reacted that way. I'm going to suggest then that the use of historical photographs in the background reproduces a kind of nothing is there, because this is all that we have left. So we have to rely on the only thing we have left to be representative, because there is nothing there. And I think this covering up through this kind of nothing is, I do think it's problematic, and I would really like curators to think twice about using photographs as illustration and using them as wallpaper. And I'm going to close with this one, because if there really is nothing more to say, I'd really like to give the last word to this particular Native artist. Hang on. Okay. The artist is Diego Romero. He is from Cochiti Pueblo, and he chose to feature the playful experience of a selfie taken by a Native woman and immortalized the moment, ironically, in the design of a pot called "No Pictures, Please." The woman's selfie authorizes her self-representation as well as the dancers, commenting on their right to represent themselves when and how they choose, and to refuse that right to outsiders. So I asked the question, has the dance been photographed? Has a taboo been broken? The selfie is in the museum. When Bart wrote, "The photographic image is full, crammed, no room, nothing can be added to it," I think nothing could be further from the truth. nothing could be added to the photograph? Well, that depends on whether you think I've been talking about nothing all this time or whether nothing really can be added to the evaluation of photographs, and I look forward to talking to you about it. Thank you.